Hey guys, Miss Sewing here with your video lesson on voting rights. In this video, we're going to talk about President Lyndon Baines Johnson. We'll then get into the Selma marches, which resulted in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Let's jump into it. So the president during the civil rights movement is Lyndon Baines Johnson, or just LBJ for short. And here we can see that he is sitting down with Martin Luther King Jr., and they are somewhere in the White House talking about civil rights and what needs to be done in the United States. Early on into Johnson's presidency, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, and it's an important piece of legislation. It is what formally ended segregation of public places, so not just schools, but all spaces. The Civil Rights Act also banned employment discrimination, so you could no longer be denied a job because of your race. Just because the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964 does not mean everything was magically better, right? There was still a huge issue of disenfranchisement, which is a $100 word. It's a long one, but it simply means the way we deny or stop somebody from getting the right to vote. This was a major issue. It was still affecting the Black community, and work still needed to be done to fix it. People were disenfranchised or stopped from voting in the 50s and 60s through things like poll taxes, those fees that needed to be paid before a person could vote, and also literacy tests, which were those quizzes and tests that were basically designed for the person taking them to fail. They were impossible and very, very difficult. These things are now illegal today. Something that still exists today in 2020, though, which is not illegal and is in fact done here in the state of Texas, are things like voter ID laws, which you could argue disenfranchise many people because a voter ID law requires you to have a physical identification, like a driver's license, in order to vote. Civil rights groups knew that voting was going to be the next issue they needed to advocate for. And so Martin Luther King and others organized a march from Selma to Montgomery. March, of course, are people just peacefully walking from one place to another, raising awareness. And of course, their focus was to demand voting rights for all Black Americans. Now, when these protesters reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they had a decision to make. At the other end of the bridge were local police ordering the protesters to turn around. And these were peaceful protesters. They had the right to cross the bridge and continue their peaceful march, but they were ordered not to. The protesters decided to continue their march from Selma to Montgomery, and they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And when they did, they were met with an event we now called Bloody Sunday. The police were there ready with clubs and tear gas. And as you can tell from this photograph, the police attacked the protesters. Many were injured. And we are looking at a famous photo of John Lewis, one of the leaders of this march, pictured here on his knees, just seconds away from being hit by this police officer in the head. He sustained a bad concussion from this event. Now, noticeably, this was on television. And that was actually pretty important because for the first time, many white Americans who had been able to pretty much ignore what was happening to Black Americans in this country were watching this live on television, and they were seeing how the protesters were peaceful and we're asking for a very reasonable thing in equal opportunity to vote. Thanks to the Selma marches, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. This was a very important law which banned racial discrimination in voting, meaning all those things that were used to disenfranchise Black people from voting, like those poll taxes and those literacy tests, were now illegal throughout the entire country. Let's analyze this map of Black voter registration before and after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You should pay special attention to the key, which is going to tell you what the red lines mean and what the blue lines mean. I'm going to pause and let you tackle this on your own before we discuss. Okay, so when I look at this map, I see two things jump off to me right away. The first is that the red lines for every single state on the map, the red is always smaller than the blue. So that tells us that from the year 1960 to the year 1966, which is the blue lines here on the chart, voter registration went up. And in some cases, really dramatically. Like, look at Mississippi. That is an insane contrast. So, to summarize, what was the impact of the Voting Rights Act on Black voter registration? Voting registration among Black Americans in the South skyrocketed. That's all for today's video, guys. Write a quick summary of what you just learned in your own words, and thanks for listening.